Okay, so sorry. Last one, the um, what's it called? The audio was kind of screwed, and I think it's because uh, if you see like my settings here, this is what I did to sort of rebalance it. Uh, I think because I recorded it this and then I played it over on these same or similar settings, that it was just way more quiet than my voice, which I apologize for. So this time, when I recorded everything in advance, I did it at full and then re-switched it down to this, which seems like it's about right. But uh, I'm not going to redo the other one. It's still passable. It's just unfortunate, but we're going to basically pick up where we left off. And we're going to move into talking about another aspect of structural violence. And we're going to start with United Healthcare because it helps us to see how malicious decision making in the structure can itself be something very harmful, terroristic, and cause a lot of unnecessary deaths and suffering. So we'll just get right to it.
And today we're looking at the massive power of United Healthcare. Before we get into United Healthcare's new strategy to shortchange doctors and patients alike, we need to talk about how they became America's largest insurer. United was founded in Minneapolis in 1977 and pioneered a new kind of insurance, treating people within closed networks of providers, health maintenance organizations, or HMOs. HMOs were pitched as a way to curb America's exploding healthcare costs, which did not happen. HMOs proliferated after 1973 as a result of the Health Maintenance Organization Act, which gave federal grants and mandated employers offer an HMO option to their employees. The law suddenly made HMOs very popular and very profitable. Alec told me about an old non-profit HMO, Physicians Health Plan.
It's a network of doctors in a health maintenance organization in Minneapolis, and they had hired United Healthcare to manage the HMO. Physicians Health Plan is a nonprofit, but United Healthcare is very much for profit.
Were the doctors happy? Was this a good system for them?
No, they were so unhappy that there was national news coverage that they were threatening to unionize. They were mad that they were being underpaid by United Healthcare, saying it was barely enough to cover their overhead. They were also alleging a conflict of interest with the chair of the nonprofit Physicians Health Plan, who was Richard Burke.
And who ran the for-profit United Healthcare?
Also Richard Burke. So this man who was running a nonprofit.
So a for-profit company in health insurance making decisions for an associated or a nonprofit directly under them. First of all, that's a conflict of interest as it stands. And then the fact that they're both run by the same guy, it's like, okay, well, now we're really looking at some even more bluntly obvious issues.
Had hired his for-profit company to manage this nonprofit tax-exempt organization.
So he hired himself. All right.
Grants from the government. Burke and United started snapping up all of these federally subsidized insurers, essentially stealing entire taxpayer-funded organizations. And it makes a lot of sense that the bill was so helpful to United Healthcare. It was written by a think tank, Interstudy.
Interstudy was founded by Paul Elwood Jr. He's this guy who's called the father of the HMO. But I also found another important figure at Interstudy. One of the directors was none other than Richard Burke.
United grew from a...
Yeah, it's just wild. It's just fucking wild. I certainly suggest going through this video yourself. I've just taken clips from it.
Companies like Anthem went on a shopping spree for these nonprofits and added them to their for-profit empire. At the same time, United continued to consolidate and spent billions acquiring other for-profit insurers. Despite their promises, healthcare costs continued to increase. But they were getting more...
It's obvious why the healthcare costs would continue to increase, because what they're describing right here is the further monopolization of that market share, right? If they're buying all of the nonprofits and turning them into for-profit health centers, and they're also buying all the smaller for-profit health centers, they're just, increasing their stranglehold on the market, which is people who need healthcare to live.
In one crucial way, rationing your healthcare. For having entire departments of people to look at claims and deny them became way cheaper.
I found an older newspaper article where a real person's job title was simply denial nurse.
Denial nurse.
Denial nurse.
It isn't just nurses poring over claims looking for excuses to deny them. Tech plays a role too. Dr. Alan Mooney, an executive at United, pioneered a system that allowed for bulk claim denials at rapid speed. United's aggressive denial or underpayment of claims has made them the target of tons of lawsuits.
They're losing a bunch of cases. They were sued by two healthcare groups, Team Healthcare and Envision. The things that they were alleging in these suits that they won was gross underpayment and mass denial of claims, right? So in the case of Envision, they were rejecting nearly half of all the doctor's claims for medical care.
Huge hospitals have...
Yeah, look at that. So denying half of the claims. This means that there was like a 50% chance for their market that when a doctor said, "Hey, my patient needs blank," they said no. And he was talking about, this was, I guess, a couple of years ago, but they were talking about expediting the rate at which they can deny claims and with the efficiency. And what they're talking about here isn't even the AI model. I don't believe. I don't think they had it up and running at the time. So that point has become even more dystopian than when this was made. I do kind of wish I checked when it was actually published. But I guess we can look at when it was uploaded on the screen capture, now that I think about it. Oh, I can't see it. There's a bunch of... Yeah, I don't know.
Was that 41% of healthcare providers needed to take out external funds to stay afloat, so like loans, stimulus, etc.
This is why doctors and practices end up needing to take out those predatory payday loans. Appealing a denied claim can take months or years, so companies will front providers that money as they hope for insurer payouts.
And that is very much why there's that strategy of delay, so that people take out the loans to pay for what needs to be done, obviously, and then hope that they'll be reimbursed when the insurance covers it. But obviously the insurance doesn't want to, because that would be against the bottom line of the for-profit motive.
So United Healthcare's constant denials can be very, very profitable for a payday loan lender, which really works out for United because, of course, they own one, Optum. Optum not only speeds up claim processing to United and other insurers, they offer something called Optum Pay Advance. They must have known that sounds terrible because they've since rebranded that service to the more sterile Capital Loan. When capital loans aren't enough for small practices, there are plenty of companies in the market to buy struggling healthcare providers outright, like Blackstone and CVS. But most importantly, United Healthcare. Now the
What he's about to say, I think I just have it in the next one, is that at the time of this recording, United Health Group employed the largest amount of doctors from anybody else. And again, this is a company, the company that employs the largest number of doctors is a company that makes profit from denying the ability for doctors to keep people healthy and to give them what they need. I trust I don't have to explain to you why that's a problem in the conversation of structural violence.
Most importantly, United Healthcare. Now the largest employer of physicians in America. 70,000 of them. United's strategy is called vertical integration. It's part of an ongoing process that gets United Healthcare a cut of every single step of the healthcare process. Say you're uninsured. You injure your knee and go to an online pharmacy for some Advil. While you're shopping around, you see an ad for a doctor specializing in knee pain. A few clicks later, you're scheduled for a knee replacement. The surgery is obviously pretty expensive, so the doctor refers you to a service offering loans to people like you. Faced with thousands of dollars in medical debt, you start considering a health insurance policy. In CEO Andrew Whitty's vision, every part of this process, the pharmacy, the doctor, the loan provider, the insurance, are all run by the same company, his.
There are very few companies in America that have a relationship with 100 million Americans, and none that have a relationship as intimate as healthcare.
Already,
Yeah, so it seems so dystopian, right? It seems so almost like cartoon villain level of evil, almost. But that's also not, when we're talking about vertical integration, I'll pause this as soon as it's up. When we're talking about vertical integration, as in getting a piece of the pie at every level, this is a strategy in many industries. If you are part of the drug trade and you own stock in privatized prisons and you own like for-profit addiction recovery services, the bigger the drug problem gets, no matter what happens, you're good, right? Because you're invested in the drug sales themselves. You're getting money from the people who get addicted to those drugs, even the ones who try to recover. And you're getting money when the people who do the illegal drug trade are incarcerated. So we can see that this strategy is something that happens a lot. And part of the reason why I've never been able to vote for a presidential candidate who wants universal health care in the United States is because there's an aspect of vertical integration with lobbying. I mean, both sides are bought. Both sides, as in the Republican Party, which is a conservative party, and the Democratic Party, which is a conservative party with some progressive talking points, but we'll at some point get into. I think it's obvious to see the Republicans' role in structural violence. I think there are a lot of people who thought that the Democratic Party is one that's really just been fighting hard, but just losing, just barely losing all the time, just almost getting that carrot to you, almost being able to protect your rights or give you more of them, or more protections to them, I should say. But we'll get into that at another date.
say their big happy healthcare family will save you money, it's more like a personal health dictator. A dictator who has a legal responsibility to make as much money as possible. And they're doing a really good job. In 2010, United was worth around $35 billion. Today, it's worth more than $450 billion. When insurers aren't using their savings to invest in vertical integration, they're using it to enrich their shareholders. In 2022, for instance, 7 major insurers, including United Healthcare, generated nearly $70 billion in profit and proceeded to spend $26 billion of that in stock buybacks. And of course, the executives, the characters you've met so far, are winning too. Richard Bork retired from the United board in 2022 with an estimated net worth of $500 million. And while United executives like to speak of firewalls between their business branches to ward off conflicts of interest, they have been busted for using their subsidiaries to manipulate the market.
New York's Attorney General charged United Health Group with using a research firm the company itself owns to manipulate reimbursement rates.
Look at that. Listen to that shit. That's just pure fucking insanity.
New York's Attorney General charged United Health Group with using a research firm the company itself owns to manipulate reimbursement rates.
That firm was called Ingenix, which...
A research group. This is... It's even like, you got research group, right? Because any study or anything that any information that they give to doctors is going to be blatantly information that is beneficial to the bottom line of United Health. Otherwise, they wouldn't make that kind of investment in creating what's essentially a fake medical journalism, Ingenix, to deceive doctors. I mean, it's very similar to what we were talking about with Purdue. Is there was intention to be deceptive, to lead people astray from, in this case, it's probably away from certain things that are more expensive for the insurance company to cover, toward practices or pharmaceuticals that is cheaper for them to cover when they don't deny the claim. Like, it wouldn't surprise me if, they got bulk whatever on whatever brand, or, I don't know what the fucking contracts are, but clearly there's a reason for them to find it beneficial to manipulate doctors and medical practice to be something that is more profitable for the company, which goes against the question, what is the best way to help as many people as possible who need healthcare?
You might have guessed shut down. Nope, they just rebranded as Optum Insight. Today, Envision alleges that United uses its negotiating power to lower reimbursements for practices or to kick them out of network, putting them in the kind of financial distress that would allow Optum to swoop in and acquire them. The Department of Justice tried to stop United's acquisition of Change, Optum's competitor that facilitates the exchange of claims information between providers and insurers, but in spite of United's history with Ingenix, the judge took CEO Andrew Whitty's word that sharing of competitor info would be against, quote, everything we stand for in the organization. With this merger, United will have access to a trove of data on what other insurers are paying and what they've negotiated with doctors and hospitals. This could allow them to unfairly undermine the competition, further cementing their healthcare monopoly.
It's also worth mentioning that before he was the CEO of United Healthcare, Andrew Whitty was the CEO of the drug maker GlaxoSmithKline.
While Whitty was in charge, GlaxoSmithKline paid $3 billion for fraud, including but not limited to bribing doctors and, quote, encouraging the prescription of unsuitable antidepressants to children.
Yeah. Like, it's so obvious why everything claimed in this video is like really bad that I almost just don't have anything to say. Like, there's very little that I feel I need to add. Okay.
I actually wanted to talk
Oh,
about this
this is
question of violence because
this is excellent, but I'm going to do this after. So that's going to be all of that one video. But then I want to get to the one that I mentioned before. I think I was talking about why some devs are celebrated. I don't know where I would have started. Probably here. I think so. Let's see if this is it. Yeah. Okay.
You should do everything in your power to avoid the point in which violence becomes necessary. Because only then, only when all peaceful avenues have been exhausted, can violence be justified. And that's a hell of a thing because violence is ugly. We have a natural revulsion to it. It takes a lot of anger to overcome such disgust. A beating, a stabbing, a shooting can all be such disturbing things to see. That's when violence is at its most explicit and visceral, direct physical contact between opposing people. Far more violence can be done with the stroke of a pen, however. A pen that seals fates, because after all, the pen is mightier than the sword. Violence can be cloaked by a labyrinth of bureaucracy. But that only works for so long before people start to understand who is really affecting their lives and why.
And I think one point that's like really important in what he's saying is that visceral reaction that we have to violence. That's what's obvious, right? That's what's visible. That's what's we can witness the harm being done to a human being. But structural violence is much closer to being invisible. It just kind of seems like, there's some people who end up dead accidentally just because of the way things are. But as we've talked about in the Purdue example, as well as the United Health example, it's not that people were trying their best and people fell through the cracks. There's been, decades long orchestration of manipulating the market and getting the largest amount of people to die for profit. One in the case of getting everyone addicted to Oxy, and the other in denying as many medical claims as they possibly can.
Can it become a trend to commit an act of violence that makes you beloved? It seems to me like that's at least possible, if not likely, and I say that without moral judgment of my own. I'm not advocating it, I'm examining it and presenting it for consideration. There are around 20,000 murders per year in the United States. Of course, you don't hear about the vast majority of them. People like my brother-in-law, who fought back against a couple of muggers and was shot in the head for it. I believe they got away with about $20. There was a single paragraph about it in a local newspaper. That's it. The murderers were never caught. The police did not seem to care all that much. To them, it was boring, routine. It was as if they already knew the killers would never be caught. They were already written off. But it's a very different story when someone of note is killed.
And I want you to think about what he's saying here, right? Like, when you look at the Luigi Mangione perp walk where they, had him surrounded by a bunch of dudes in the tactical gear, I mean, how many tax dollars were spent on just entire droves of police officers looking for him? Would that have happened if you were the one who was killed by some person? Probably not. And we do see that the justice system is something that very much operates differently from the wealthy and the poor. Now, there's no way that the amount of manpower that was deployed to find Luigi in that first week or whatever in New York City, there's no way that amount of manpower is done for every one of the murders that are committed in New York City. There's just no way. And what's obvious about that is, rich lives matter more than poor, or, there's layers to this wealth privilege. I think I can move on.
I would imagine that it's at least disconcerting for the peers of that CEO, especially as they try to live in a society that cheered for his killer. A society that is more heavily on.
So, I guess I missed a vitally important step there. He is directly talking about Brian Thompson's assassination and how his death was largely celebrated
Than ever before. I fear that his peers will take away the exact wrong message, which will be the status quo plus more security. To the peers of that CEO, I don't want to see you be killed. I don't even want there to be a death penalty. But I'd much rather see you be the change so that people have no desire to kill you. And I want that to be the reason that you are no longer in danger. It wasn't like this.
And this really brings up the point of agency. Who has the power to make these systemic changes? It's the decision makers in these companies, because it's something that's unilateral, right? The public doesn't get to vote on what Purdue does. The public doesn't get to vote on what United Health Group does. In fact, the employees don't even really get to vote. It's entirely an authoritarian structure. It is unilateral decisions are made, and if you're in the crosshairs, tough luck. So what he's saying here is basically what I've said earlier in this series, is the idea that what we understand as human rights will be defended, and how violently they will be defended depends on the structures that are in place to protect human beings. And when you look at something like this, there really aren't structures in place to protect human beings from the kinds of the mass murders that companies like Purdue and United Health Group have committed.
When your chosen profession affects the lives of millions of people, ethical behavior is absolutely mandatory. But what if your profession itself makes ethical behavior impossible? Well, then nobody should be doing it in the first place. and the mere act of doing it becomes an indictment. What if more people died because of you than because of bin Laden? Not because of any sort of ideological hatred, not because of explicit, highly visible violence like flying planes into buildings, but merely because it's part of doing business. A stroke of the pen. It's so much more civil, isn't it? It allows you to pretend that you have the moral high ground. We have the ability to save your life, but somebody else's pen said no.
Yeah. And this is where we're talking, there's such thing as like structural violence of negligence and structural violence of like active or of a malicious intent, where the act of that stroke of a pen is an act of violence.
But then the internet happened and the world got a lot smaller, a lot more connected, and we started hearing about how other countries have free healthcare. So then they started arguing that it's not exactly free because they have to pay for it in their taxes. But as it turns out, it would be less expensive to pay for it through your taxes than through a bloated, greedy middleman that can base your medical care on their profits.
Yes.
It's fully understood.
And another thing about like the taxation thing, we are at a point where we would not even really need to tax a huge portion of the population. I mean, if we taxed companies instead of individuals and just allowed individuals to volunteer whatever percentage of their paycheck they wanted to, including zero being a number. In fact, we should encourage anybody who makes less than a comfortable living wage to not have to pay any taxes whatsoever. We could easily fund these programs. I mean, the numbers are there. Just in what some of the largest companies bring in profits, it would cover so much. And it's taxation under a place like the United States is in effect theft, because it's all under that threat of violence. It's always under the gun. But not if you create a system where individuals volunteer for it and the cost of doing business in a country is part of contributing to that country and its infrastructure and the health of its people. When I talk about my solutions to every issue with the United States later, we're going to get into that. But for now, it's just, if you're feeling cringy about the idea of, taxation, I get it. Because right now, if we were to tax the rich, I don't really think we'd see a whole lot of benefit toward the working and lower classes, because there's so much lobbying, so much corruption, so much insider trading that, if we taxed Bezos, we would probably just double the amount of bombs that we drop on other people overseas or send to Israel, and we'd do, I don't know. We would just, I could see a lot more going toward infrastructure, maybe to the school system, but I think in order for taxation to be fully legitimate, we have to do what I described in terms of it's on an individual level, voluntary, mandatory for businesses. If you're going to conduct business in this country, even if you're making X amount of profits or more, you do that, and you also, I lost my train of thought. Shit. Well, damn. But yeah, that's something for another day. But there are certainly ways you can make taxation legitimate, because in order to do it, you would have to have the people choose the direction of their money, right? So if you were to say, oh, I volunteer to contribute 10% of my paycheck toward taxation, you should be able to say, I want, 2% to go toward housing initiatives, 2% to go toward Medicaid, 2% to go toward, more money to schools or whatever. Like, you as an individual should be able to, if you decide to contribute to the government and the people in the nation with a percentage of your paycheck, you should absolutely be able to decide where that money goes. And what's taken from the businesses, that should be delegated to, every whatever balance is found to make the society function in a way that is severely reduced structural violence.
That a person with limited means can easily be discouraged from and even incapable of legally challenging a massive corporation, especially while going through serious medical issues. After all, such corporations are bigger than any of us. They're quasi-governments. Even though they're not alive.
And this is also another thing that's like really important to understand. His term there, quasi-governments, when we're talking about the idea of justice applying unequally to people in this country, in my essay, Why Poverty is Violence, and that explains the epigenetics of the stressors of poverty and how it affects the human nervous system and the function of the human body, I do talk about, I talk about a lot of things in there. It's pretty crammed, but there are a ton of people who are in prison right now because they couldn't afford to prove their innocence, or they have court fee debts that they couldn't pay because of how much it cost for them to prove their innocence. And, any reasonable person would understand that as what it is, debtor's prison. And to the point of companies being quasi-governments, I want you to look at what happened to Guatemala in the 1940s and 50s. There was a company called the United Fruit Company. It's now largely Chiquita. I think it might have disbanded into multiple companies, but Chiquita is like the main one. United Fruit Company owned as many banana plantations as they possibly could, and they even bought up farmable land they had no intention of using to further a stranglehold on the market, to monopolize produce as much as they could. In addition to that, they also owned the port towns, so they were getting a piece of the pie on everything that was imported or exported. And I think they owned what few rail systems were there. So they had more influence on the economy than the Guatemalan government of the time did. And there was eventually a democratic election that put somebody into power in the Guatemalan government who required, with like some sort of eminent domain-ish thing, that all of the land that isn't being used, they didn't even go as far as I would have in order to like break up that monopoly on produce. They were like, all the farmland that's not being used, that is owned, is going to be paid what they reported on their taxes it was worth. And the US was so heavily invested and people in the Pentagon and people in the CIA and people in the FBI, these different decision makers had a ton of stock in it. They absolutely bombed the shit out of the capital of Guatemala to get rid of this guy. And we're talking, this is in the 1950s. So the verdict was in terms of like everyone in the world hated fascism. They put in a guy. So Jacobo Arbenz was the guy who was democratically elected and was giving land back to the people of Guatemala so that they can farm produce themselves to a larger extent and be less forced into the slavery of the plantations, because that's effectively what it was. A lot of people got paid in vouchers that they could only use to buy food from the company they were working for. So again, perfect example of slavery with extra steps. But that whole, if you want to see like a perfectly articulated example of how corporations have more political influence than the governments of the lands that they operate in, I would say United Fruit Company is an excellent place to start with that.
They're classified. First of all, insurance companies have no business making medical decisions to decide what's necessary. And second of all, United Health Group makes record profits every single year.
Which means more people
while
dying
Americans
every year.
struggle more and more every single year. So I don't want to hear about his version of unsustainability. What he really means is that the level of profit margin that they currently enjoy would be unsustainable. So people are going to have to be sacrificed on that altar, the altar of sustained high profits. That's what he really means. And the news. The truth is, though, this is only a fraction of what's happening. Healthcare is only one aspect. What you have to understand is that getting away with unethical behavior directly correlates to how many people you affect. Wrong one person, and you might get away with it, sure. Like those guys who killed my brother-in-law. Wrong millions, and you have a much bigger problem to navigate. When somebody wrongs you, there's a visceral feeling of violation. If someone points a gun in your face and takes your wallet, it's a feeling that stays with you for the rest of your life. Coming home and finding that your house has been broken into is a grotesque feeling. Some stranger coming into your life and taking something from you, something that you worked for, can feel like a partial death. And in a way, it is. How many hours, days, or even years of work did it take to purchase that which was stolen from you? In a way, all that time you worked was stolen too. And time is the only thing you truly have in this world. People only.
And I want to mention right here that, this idea of your time being stolen from you in the event that, some burglar takes your valuables. This is true for all kinds of things, right? I mean, if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you're working like 40 to 60 hours a week on something that doesn't pay enough to live comfortably, that's such a high percentage of your life that is going toward building towards something. So when something like Martin Shkreli buying, I think it was Daraprim, and increasing its price per pill because he bought the patent. Uh, he increased the price per pill from like $13 to $750. That's an act of just stealing those hours away. It's I would say it's the same with any captive market, right? I, I would say landlords are, always guilty of stealing your hours away, because what you're doing is you're putting in hours of your life to be able to have that roof over your head, and, you know, whatever amount of money they decide goes to them from you. So it's obviously rent-seeking behavior. It's, the what coined the term. And so much of these captive markets are parasitic to the point where I really wish people would see it more in these terms of, if there's an unspoken trust between landowners, right, who benefit from owning rental properties, that they want to increase the amount they charge, they don't ever have to formally get together and say, how much are we going to hike up prices this year? Because they all have the same interest. They're all invested in the same sector. So there's like an understanding that if we each push it up a bit and nobody goes way too high and price themselves out of the market, then it's obvious what we're going to see happen. And it's exactly what we do see happen. And in addition to that, another layer of malicious structural violence is the amount of lobbying that goes into making sure housing initiatives are always underfunded and that cities don't build enough residential areas. Housing is something that would be one of the easiest fucking problems to fix when we're talking about the systemic allocation of wealth. Honestly, you could explain the problem to a 4-year-old and they would tell you the right answer. You could say, hey, so there's this problem, right? We have there are 5 dogs that live on the street, but there are only 4 dog houses, and sometimes the one gets really cold. Well, what do we do? The kid would be like, oh, we'll just build enough dog houses for all the dogs on the street, and then they all have a dog house. And it is that fucking simple. Like, we can get into nuance, and we'll probably will in the future. But that is one of the most obvious and easy problems to solve that is affecting so many people in this country. Everybody in this country is paying too much for the idea of having a place to fucking live. We'll continue.
Tolerate that up until a certain point. And after that point, they become ready, willing, and able to fight for what they have. Videos of robberies are easy to spread online. They anger people. But if the robber is thwarted somehow, people really love to see that. It's a very visible crime, and as such, a lot of people fear it and prepare for it by arming themselves. And there is very little compassion for criminals willing to threaten or commit violence against others to steal their belongings. In my video called...
And one more thing on that, it's obvious to see why, right? I mean, it's blatantly wrong for somebody to rob another person at gunpoint. But these are also, in large part, a lack of resource crime. There wouldn't be people feeling a level of manufactured, might I add, desperation that would require them to hold someone up at gunpoint in order to empty the register. I mean, I was just going on a rant about rent prices and how they're going to increase every year unless there are policy changes that won't happen because, the only two political parties in this system are both heavily invested in owning rental properties and making sure that housing is not a human right. It's more about insider trading for that sector than it is about whether or not people should have a place to live. But again, with that, it's if you were to create a society where people aren't forced into desperation for not having enough resources, there would not be nearly as many crimes like robbery that are to gain resources.
Weaponizing young men with fear, I talk about how people have poor risk assessment abilities, how they will irrationally fear things far less likely to happen than things far more likely to happen. That applies here as well. In the United States, every year, around $53 billion is stolen from people. Robberies only account for $0.34 billion in theft per year out of the $53 billion. That means robberies only account for 0.64% of what is stolen from Americans per year. That's what you see on the news and on Twitter and what politicians use to sell themselves as the solution
and to
for
sell a fucking
rampant
security
crime.
state.
So who on earth is stealing the other 99%? Well, $39.2 billion of the $52 billion is what companies steal from their employees per year. That's 74%. 74% of the theft in the United States per year is companies stealing from their employees. That's minimum wage violations, overtime violations, rest break violations, and off-the-clock violations. The truth is that you do not have to worry about the poor stealing from you nearly as much as you have to worry about the wealthy stealing from you.
And those are, again, things that feel more invisible, right? Or like there's an element of plausible deniability. Like if you didn't get paid correctly for your overtime, it seems like it could just easily be a mistake. But when you're looking at those numbers, it's a lot.
Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission was a 5-4 Supreme Court decision in 2010, which made it so that any corporation or nonprofit organization could spend as much money as they wanted on any political campaign, and it could be dark money, meaning that they didn't have to report it.
So if you're watching this from outside the United States, this is the decision that allowed this corrupt level of money in government in terms of when people are talking shit from the states about lobbying, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about the unlimited bankrolling to politicians, which completely subverts, or at least, mostly subverts the entire idea of representatives being elected to represent their constituents, because there's so much legal bribery called lobbying in the United States that it's really hard to believe that representatives will choose their constituents over the interests of the corporations that are lining their pockets. And like he said, doesn't even all have to be reported.
This is, of course, how your government is bought. Incidentally, insurance company PACS donated $23 billion to candidates in 2024. What's interesting is that before this decision was made, There was actual bipartisan debate on climate change. But after that decision, the climate change debate became divided sharply along political lines. The facts don't care about what happened after the Citizens United Supreme Court decision. Oil and gas expenditures to Republican campaigns skyrocketed, and just enough money was given to Democrats to make them ineffective opposition. They started giving a hell of a lot of money away. So, what were they getting in return? Hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies. Their investment paid off quite well for them. Not only do they make record profits, but they get tons of your tax dollars because the corporations and the government are working together like the mob. If you don't play ball, then they fund your political opponent and get them in office. Slip the people in control of the money some cash, and even line the government with your executives, and in return they deregulate and send you tons of subsidies that result in billions of dollars, which causes a market advantage that is about as far as you can get from free market capitalism as you could possibly imagine.
Yeah, and I really want to mention this as well, is when we're talking about things that are very much fascism, but like soft fascism, or it seems like it's not the case. When we're talking this level of merger of corporation and state, we're really talking about, at best, being right outside the door of fascism in terms of this, like this argument alone. But
Yet they want you to believe that anyone who is resistant to this corruption is somehow a hardcore communist, un-American, or anti-business. It's ridiculous Red Scare tactics. Get the regular people to fight among themselves, cause people to complain about the inner city mother of five getting food stamps and money for rent, which causes people to call her a welfare queen, while billions of your tax dollars are being siphoned off to the robber barons that are literally destroying your children's futures.
And in addition to that, let's go back just a little bit.
While billions of your tax while billions. Get the regular people to fight among themselves, cause people to complain about the inner city mother of five getting food stamps and money for rent, which causes people to call her a welfare queen.
Another thing that I've mentioned several times before are the numbers, I don't have them on me right now, of massive corporations whose employees are on some of those benefits, like SNAP. And it's strange that somebody who's not being paid by their employer enough getting these benefits are considered, welfare queens, when really it's the responsibility of the corporation to pay its fucking employees. It is not the responsibility of the taxpayers, though, of course, when we talk about the merger of corporation and state, we understand why the policy is what it is. In terms of just practicality. But if we want to call anybody a welfare queen, we need to be doing it to like the Starbucks and Amazons and Walmarts of the world.
While billions of your tax dollars The only reason it's not called criminal is because they paid off the people who make the laws. The criminals made it legal to do crime. And you are the victim. You're the mark. You just don't know it because it wasn't done with a gun or a knife. It was done with the stroke of a pen. So it looks so civilized. What's the result of all this? Well, the result is a massive hoarding of wealth. 80% of our country I could show you some graphs like the ones in this older video.
Here's that
No, these
ideal
are
we
excellent.
asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
Notice the comments, all understanding how much worse it is now than it was then.
Yeah. And then there's, I think this is the last one that I am going over today from that video, but Why Some Deaths Are Celebrated is a great video essay. So I suggest you watch it. Part of the problem with me like cutting it up is certain parts of the conversation are lost, and then it's like, so, you know, something like this might be a little jarring. Let me know if it is.
This is what wealth inequality in the United States actually looks like. This grain of rice represents $200,000. That's about the median net worth of a citizen in the United States, which means if you took our population and drew a line split down the middle, about half of us have this much or less. Half of us have this much or less. Just going to put that down right there, 1 grain of rice. This is $1 million, 5 grains of rice. When most of us think rich, we think of $1 million. This is $100 million. This is about the net worth of CEOs who delay and deny care for sick Americans. This is also about the net worth of CEOs who tell Americans to eat cereal if they can't afford food for their hungry kids. This is $277 million. This is Elon Musk's personal investment in the 2024 elections. This is what he spent to buy the presidency. This is $1 billion. This is the approximate net worth of Vivek Ramaswamy. Only 800 people in the United States have this much money or more. As a frame of reference, think about how many people you went to high school with. Only 800. And this is $6.3 billion. This is the approximate net worth of Donald Trump. He recently said in an interview that he doesn't think he can bring grocery prices down after running his campaign on a promise to do so. He also blames immigrants who have less than a fraction of a grain of rice each for a lot of the financial troubles facing our country. And this is Elon Musk. He's worth $400 billion. He spent $277 million on the 2024 election cycle, while we have homeless veterans on our streets and hungry kids in our schools. This is what actual wealth disparity looks like in America. Each grain of rice is worth $200,000. And Elon Musk also wants to fire 75% of our federal workforce, which includes a majority of veterans. He wants to fire 75% of these people who have a single grain of rice trying to earn a living and feed their families because he says that that's inefficient. Musk, Ramaswamy, and certain members of Congress also want to consider cutting social welfare programs to support people with less than a single grain of rice from going into poverty. They want to look at cutting these programs because they believe that that's inefficient.
You have no idea the depths of the corruption, the depth.
And unfortunately, I don't know if I have the time to get to what else I wanted to get to. I think that was the last video of this. Let's just play. Yeah, okay, cool. So that gets us there. So let's find this.
I actually wanted to talk about this question of violence because that's been one of the things, the liberals, you cannot talk about violence, you cannot do any violent acts of violence. This guy was not doing acts of violence. And you see, there is violence and violence. One of our listeners actually sent me a very interesting quote by Frederick Engels, and I thought it was very fitting. He says, "When one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another such that death results, we call the deed manslaughter. When the assailant knew in advance that the injury would be fatal, we call this deed murder. But when society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position that they inevitably meet a too early and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by a sword or bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessaries of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them through the strong arm of the law to remain in such conditions until that death ensues which is the inevitable consequence, knows that these thousands of victims must perish and yet permits these conditions to remain, its deed is murder just as surely as the deed of the single individual, disguised malicious murder. Murder against which none can defend himself, which does not seem what it is, because no man sees the murderer, because the death of the victim seems a natural one, since the offense is more one of omission than of commission. But murder it remains." As Frederick Engels, The Conditions of the Working Class in England in 1845.
It's just an excellent quote. When we're talking about structural violence, it's just so well put that it's again in terms of like the visibility of it. When we're talking about being murdered by behavioral violence, you see the killer. The killer's right there. But with a lot of the structural violence, the decision makers that cause thousands of people to die, you don't see them. You never see the face. I think we can do the rest quick. I might not be talking too much though.
11th of September 2001, an attack planned by Osama bin Laden killed 2,977 Americans, widely regarded as the worst terrorist attack in history. His motives included the U.S.'s support of Israel against Palestine and Lebanon.
So, yeah, this is talking about how Osama bin Laden's motives were U.S. imperialism. If we're talking about the narrative, which is widely understood and accepted, that this man, Osama bin Laden, was responsible for causing nearly 3,000 deaths. I mean, that's the main takeaway.
This was the Galactic Empire. The Taliban was the freedom-fighting rebellion, and he wanted to strike the evil empire however he could. But since he attacked civilians, history considers Osama bin Laden a terrorist. The terrorist. The US declared war on a couple oil-rich nations in response, total coincidence, and after a 10-year manhunt, 24 Navy SEALs assassinated bin Laden and 4 innocent people who were with him. Over 90% of Americans approved of this assassination. This guy killed 3,000 Americans.
And this is, again, this is one of those deaths that are celebrated, right? We had an understanding that, regardless of whatever, a large-scale terrorist attack that kills thousands of people is a bad thing. And to, get rid of somebody who did that kind of thing is something to be celebrated, which is exactly why when the CEO of United Healthcare was assassinated, it was the same kind of reason to celebrate.
The United States is the only developed nation in the world without universal health care. The only developed nation. And a universal healthcare system would save over 68,000 lives per year. Those most responsible for these deaths are the gargantuan health insurance corporations who maintain the status quo of privatized healthcare by bribing politicians for favorable legislation.
They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else.
Private health insurance is the third biggest lobby in the U.S. They spent $157 million on bribes in 2023 alone, lobbying the government to keep healthcare privatized. United Health is significantly the largest. They have 15% of the market share, so by this metric, they're responsible for 15% of those 68,000 uninsured deaths, or approximately 10,000 dead Americans every year. But let's be charitable and say lobbying is only half responsible for our privatized healthcare. So I'll argue the CEO of United Healthcare, Brian Thompson, was responsible for 5,000 deaths every year. And this is just uninsured deaths. Many others are insured, but...
And what I really liked about this idea, even though we would have to work pretty hard to figure out what the actual level of responsibility is in terms of how many deaths, I think it's an important thing going forward that we're going to have to figure out, how much blood is on the people who facilitate and contribute to structural violence, how much blood is on their hands. Because obviously, though I mention, the structure of a company being one that is authoritarian, unilateral, there would still be some of that percentage of the 10,200 or whatever that number was of those deaths would have to be contributing or attributed to the investors as well as the employees. Like even somebody in the mailroom of a company that commits mass murder as its business model, there's blood on their hands, but obviously they aren't as responsible as the CEO or anything like that. But it's something to consider is how will we do the math to figure out how many people die as a result of the decisions of certain politicians or CEOs?
Freedom-fighting mass murderer for his ideals. He thought that the US was the empire. This is objectively correct. But since he opted to target civilians, he's definitively disqualified from being a hero. Luke didn't kill civilians by dive-bombing his T-65B X-Wing class starfighter into the tallest skyscrapers in the financial district of Coruscant. So while bin Laden correctly assessed the US as a global villain, he still pursued terror over change, not a hero. The Navy SEALs who killed bin Laden are considered heroes. They killed the guy who was responsible for 3,000 innocent deaths. The Navy SEALs killed for justice. Brian Thompson, responsible for 5,000 deaths every year, wasn't killing for justice. He wasn't killing for his ideals. He wasn't killing because he was a freedom fighter. He killed for money.
Brian Thompson wasn't an upstanding businessman. He was a mafia boss, standing in between doctors and patients who made his millions by bankrupting people and letting them die. He may never have held a gun directly to someone's temple, but that doesn't mean he wasn't a killer.
The reality in this country is, if you kill people with a gun, it is very obvious to everybody what's going on and you're rightly deplored. If it is a more systemic kind of killing, if people are being killed through claim denial letters, through a deliberate practice of saying no to a certain form of care that you know you're going to end up granting, but if you say no, 80% of people will lose steam and not appeal successfully, and you'll only have to give it to 20% of those people, and you factor that into your balance sheet. And if that is not an incidental thing that happens, that's actually how you make money. You cannot expect to live in a society in which that rage goes nowhere, just fizzles out and dissipates.
If you compile all the facts about how United Health operates its business, there's no version of that story where Brian Thompson is not a supervillain. He was killing more Americans than the worst terror attack of all time every year.
But this dude, make no mistake, he was a killer. He was such a good killer that the company was like, damn, Brian. Damn, you cold-blooded.
The problem with saying violence isn't the answer is that highly organized violence is already perpetrated against all of us every day. Saying violence isn't the answer is literally just accepting the violence towards us and demonizing self-defense against it. The fact of the matter is, we are losing the class war, and health insurance CEOs to understand the propaganda of the state, it reveals the walls of our prison. Ken Klippenstein asks,
where are the politicians' statements naming each of the thousands of people who die every year from a lack of insulin, a drug that costs almost nothing to manufacture?
1.3 million Americans are forced to ration their insulin. Why would our government let thousands of people die due to corporate greed? Because this is a government that protects capital, not people. There are 27 empty houses for each homeless person in the US. Why would our government allow capital owners to hoard housing when every major US city has an ever-worsening homelessness problem because our government serves capital, not people. And then this same government has the gall to preach... Fuck, man, I'm so tired. This same government has the gall to preach the importance of nonviolence. In 2024 alone, our government had an $800 billion military budget, funded multiple genocides, shot college students in their faces with rubber bullets, and allowed homelessness to rise 18%, all in 1 year. The state can be violent, and you cannot, because the state has a monopoly on violence.
You let one ant stand up to us, then they all might.
Might have been the last of that video. Oh yeah, Jesus fucking Christ. Now we'll get into this on another day. But again, when we're talking about, I gotta go, but when we're talking about structural violence, you know, we've just gone through this for 2 videos. That scene in Follow the House of Usher, where there's that character who caused the deaths of thousands of people, standing at the window, watching dead bodies just rain down from the sky. I think that's just a good visual metaphor, because like we go through this video, right, and we see the graphs of the inequality. We see, you know, these numbers, these grains of rice, and it's easy to forget that these are like human beings who, they're not like a point on a graph or one of the 10,200 whatever people who died. It's easy to understand, it's easy to lose that these are each data point is a human being who was loved and who had dreams and had aspirations and wanted to live a fulfilling life with their family. So I think the visual metaphor in the Follow the House of Usher that we watched last video is something that's really excellent in displaying in a different way just how personal this mass murder is. But I'm out. I will see you soon, I'm sure.